Welcome to Wildfire Resilience, Strategies, Codes, Data, and the Wildland-Urban Interface. Thanks for joining us today. I'm Mary James, Director of Publications for Passive House Accelerator. With the growing occurrence of devastating wildfires, there's a strong imperative to make buildings fire safe. Fortunately, Passive House can be a clear pathway to achieve these goals. And today we have three excellent speakers to discuss fire resilience. Birgitte Messerschmidt is Director of Research at the National Fire Protection Association, and she is based in Massachusetts. Andrew Michler is Principal of Hyperlocal Architecture, a practice based in Masonville, Colorado. Rob Nicely is President of Carmel Building and Design, which is located in Carmel, California. And before we get started with the presentations, as a reminder, as questions arise, please submit them in the chat for discussion afterwards. Thanks so much, and we'll get started with Birgitte.
Thank you so much. It's an honor for me to be here today and to talk to you about wildfire resilience and particularly the role of our buildings. So let me get started with setting the scenes about the threat from wildfires. I don't think it's a surprise to any one of you to hear that wildfires are bigger, burn longer, and cause more damage and kill more people than before. The magnitude and frequency of wildland fires are worsening, as illustrated in the graph to the right, showing an increase in annual average acreage burned when you look at the average acreage burned since 2000 compared to that in the 80s and the 90s. But also just listen to the news every day. We hear about these major wildfires that are threatening us. Me sitting here on the East Coast this year, the smoke from the Canadian wildfires have come down and bothered us many times. So I think this is old news that I'm bringing, that wildfires are a threat, and that threat is only getting bigger. So what I'm going to talk about here today, in the area that I'm really concerned about, is the wildland-urban interface, or as I'm going to refer to it many times during the presentation, the WUI. So this is where humans and their development meet or intermix with the wildland fuel. So this is where we see the catastrophe can happen. So as we talk about the wildfires and when they meet the WUI, it is that's when they really become so destructive. They spread into the urban environment, and now the buildings start fueling the fire, and that can lead to continuous spread from building to building. This is when a wildfire turns into a conflagration, a large and destructive fire that threatens human life, animal life, health, and or property. And a conflagration can potentially destroy entire neighborhoods. A conflagration is also what we saw in the Great Fire of London more than 350 years ago. We've been here before, we've seen it before, we've learned from it before, but yet it has the potential to happen again and has happened several times in recent history when wildfires meet the wildland-urban interface. So what happens in the conflagration? Now the buildings, they're the fuels, and hence the building materials used will then become the new parts of the building and create embers that will allow the fire to spread to other buildings. Fire spread can also be directly from building to building due to direct radiation in areas where the buildings are close together. And this means that some of the traditional ways we've thought about fires as building separation related to fire safety based on fire starting within the building, spreading through the windows and so on, might not at all be the same as when we are talking about an entire building on fire. Suddenly that distance, it should be a lot longer in order to prevent that fire to jump from one building to another. So there's a lot of challenges in this. So let's go in and talk a little bit about how wildfires ignite these buildings in the wildland-urban interface. And honestly, I'm a structure fire person. And when I started working at NFPA about 6 years ago, I did not know much about wildfire. And I thought about wildfire, when that ignites buildings, it's because it's like this big fire come barreling down like a train down the track and attacking the buildings with this big fire front. But was I wrong? Our wildfire team here at NFPA educated me very quickly, saying, no, Birgitte, that is not the major risk to buildings. It is actually the embers. And according to research, 90% of homes that burn down in the wildfire, it has been because they've been ignited by embers. Now, the interesting thing is embers, they are traveling way in front of the fire front. So they can travel typically 30 to 100 feet, but they've actually been observed traveling miles downwind from a fire. So it really just shows the impact these wildfires can have way beyond the fire front as well. So, and as I said before, then when the wildfire spreads into the Wildland-Urban interface, now the buildings become the fuel, and their materials then can become embers that then will allow the fire to spread further into the built environment. So what does that look like? So research by IBHS, the Insurance Institute for Business and Home Safety, they've done a lot of amazing work showing the impact of embers from wildfires on our built environment. So what you see is the embers come out right against the building, and they start collecting on the structure, on the roof, in the gutters, wherever you have little nooks and crannies, but also next to the structure, so down next to the building. So this is where it becomes really important what the building is made of and the surrounding area of the building is made of. So if you have non-combustible materials, that will help prevent the structure from igniting. So if I have the embers landing down on next to my building, and if I have a wooden deck and that starts burning, suddenly it becomes a bigger fire that attacks the building. If it lands on something that is not ignitable, then you just have the pile of embers burning, which can still be a threat. Now then comes, what is the building built of? How can that potentially ignite like the siding, and can that spread the fire up along the building into the roof, etc.? But even if my building was made completely out of a non-combustible exterior and with only a rock garden around it with nothing that can ignite, I can still be in trouble because embers can also enter through any opening in the building. And this is really one of the insidious things about them. They can enter through any vents that we have in buildings and that we need to have for other reasons. And therefore, it's extremely important not just to think about what the building is built of, but also to make sure that all vents that you have in a building are covered with non-combustible mesh screening. And there's tests and approvals for these. So these are just some of the points I want to bring forward to you about the importance of thinking about what the building is built of. And I'll get back to that a little bit more. But as I said, it also has to do with the landscaping around your building. So when these embers come, if you have highly combustible mulch right next to your building and some plants that burn easily, then suddenly you have a much bigger fire quicker than when just the embers alone. So each of us in the Wildland-Urban interface, we can do ours at least to start limiting the fuel that are surrounding our buildings. Really help work together as communities to ensure that our landscaping is fire resilient. Here from NFPA, we have the program called Firewise USA, which is all about residents reducing wildfire risks together in the community by ensuring that we have less combustibles near the buildings and in the community to limit the fire spread within that community. But back to the buildings, because I said this is what I really want to focus on here, because I want to make you aware that what happens when these buildings become involved in the fires and why it is such a big deal that when they become involved in the fire. And the reason for that is each of these buildings that we build, they are a very condensed fuel package. I mean, really condensed. So let me take you a little bit through a tour. And this is not passive houses or anything. This is just, I've looked at traditional way of building buildings here in the United States and just try to analyze how much fuel do we actually have in these buildings. So let's start. We start with the framing of the building. And as you can see, we have a lot of lumber in our buildings. A lot. Not insignificant. I'll get back to the numbers on it. But this is where we start. And this is the traditional way that we've been building for many years. But I just want people to be aware when it comes to fire and the whole buildings burns down, this starts to have an impact. So we start with lots of lumber. And on top of that, we add a lot of wood-based boards, whether it's for the siding on the outside, if it's for the underlay for the roof, whether it's for the flooring inside. We add a lot of wood-based boards to the building as well. Now, of course, we also put the roof shingles on top of that. Now, we want to save energy, and which is, passive houses, fabulous to do. So what do? We insulate. Of course we do. And depending on the choices that we have when we insulate, it could potentially mean an additional layer of fuel. Often, for instance, spray polyurethane or adding polystyrene boards on the outside is adding a layer of fuel to this package that we have in the building. So something to consider as well. And as we take this whole nice package of lumber, wood-based boards, and the insulation, of course, now we're going to make it all look pretty from the outside. So we wrap it up in beautiful siding and roofing to have it all weatherproofed in the end. So this is what I looked at when I said, okay, how much is there then in a building? How much fuel is there? So I made a very simple calculation on a 2,000 square foot home, which some would say is a small home in this country. But that's what I did, and did some rough calculations on how many pounds of fuel did I have in there. And these are my results. I looked at the lumber and the plywood, the foam sheathing, spray polyurethane, wood siding, asphalt shingles, and calculated based on sheets, information sheets from the from manufacturers. I got to a total of almost 60,000 pounds of things that can burn just in the structure. So we have so much in just the building itself. I'm not looking at the interior, not even looking at floor coverings, electrical, plumbing, or anything like that. This is the raw structure. So this is the potential fuel load that we have in each of the homes we have out in these environments. And just to give you a little bit of a idea of what that means compared to the natural environment, according to information that I found, a 50-foot tall pine tree weighs approximately 2,000 pounds. So if we have a building here with almost 60,000 pounds of combustibles, we now have what equals about 50-foot tall pine trees on our property instead of a building. That's a very dense woods that will be burning there, but this is now our building instead. So it just shows that when a wildfire meets the Wildland-Urban interface, it can really put the fire on steroids because it is such a condensed fuel package. And we need fire-resilient buildings and structures. This is a picture one of my colleagues took in Paradise, California, after the tragic fire out there. And it just shows that these fires take out everything that's combustible. You might say, why are you calculating everything? This is why. Because it burns everything that can burn when the fire gets serious enough. So we need to consider how we build the buildings. And I'm not saying that we should change our traditional way of using wood, etc. No, but what we do have to do is to think about how we can protect it when we do have such a condensed fuel package. How can we make those part of the buildings that really interact with the fire first better protect the rest of the building? So just to get into the resilience, is that resilience really has to happen through risk management. And very simple in my view, risk is hazard times a consequence. And the hazards that we have out in the Wildland-Urban interface, it's the vegetation that we have, it's the topography, it's the weather and the wind. And yes, we can control vegetation and we can control where we build related to the topography. Weather and wind are out of our control. And the consequence, that one is all about our structures, our landscaping around that, and the community. So we really, truly need to try and predict that hazard of where we are building and then quantify the risk of that, what we are doing in that neighborhood. It is important that we look at this to make sure that we get wildfire resilience. And I just want to point you to some information that I think could be extremely helpful to you in your work. Again, it's the Insurance Institute of Business and Home Safety. They have made this really great program called wildfireprepared.org, where you can go in and they have all kinds of information and advice on how to build structures that are wildfire resilient. So if you're not aware of this, I strongly encourage you to go and check this out and follow their advice. And now, of course, you'll probably look at me and tell, well, isn't this going to be horribly expensive? How can many people afford making their buildings so wildfire resilient? Well, my final slide, my final point I would like to say is it's not as expensive as you think it's going to be. So Headwater Economics compared the cost of building a typical home compared to a wildfire-resistant home. So they looked at two different levels of wildfire resistance, the enhanced and the optimum. So building materials and assemblies for 5 primary home components were considered. And this included the roof covering, vents, roof edge, and gutters, under eave areas such as eaves, soffits, and vents, the exterior wall, siding, windows, doors, trim, and vents, the attached deck, the horizontal surface area, rails, and under the deck footprint, and then the near home landscaping, so the immediate 5-foot perimeter around the home, as well as the attached deck. And overall, they found that wildfire-resistant construction adds approximately 2 to 13% to the entire cost of a new home. So despite the added cost, investing in wildfire-resistant homes and neighborhoods increases overall community resilience for generations to come and return greater long-term benefits, both in energy efficiency and durability. So we really need to consider this in our overall consideration of a wildfire resilient community. And that was all from me. Thank you very much.
They evacuating us. Oh my God, oh my God.
Holy cow. That's crazy.
On December 30th, 2021, the most destructive wildfire in Colorado's history, known as the Marshall Fire, destroyed more than 1,000 homes in the suburbs of Denver and claimed the lives of 2 people.
This place is burning over here.
The Sobtis were one of the many families who lost their home. Amita, her husband Manu, and their 2 kids were on vacation at the time of the fire and watched everything unfold through their security cameras.
And we were on a beach, I remember, and we were in disbelief. We were like, this can't be happening, we'll be fine.
But when they returned to Colorado 5 days later, they saw firsthand the damage that was done.
It was just gone, it was ashes. One car was in the garage that had blown out pretty much, and the garage door had melted and fallen on it, and the rest, everything was ash. It was a it was a hole in the face of earth, and just, it was disbelief. I could not believe that the entire neighborhood was wiped out with that one fire.
Wildfires are not uncommon in Colorado, but the Marshall Fire was an outlier. Most fires affect rural parts of the state, and this fire destroyed suburban neighborhoods. And it happened in the middle of winter, leading some scientists, like Senlin He from the National Center for Atmospheric Research, to conclude that fire season, once limited to the summer, is now a year-round threat.
Climate change has affected the Colorado climate. First, the increased temperature in the past few decades actually leads to melting of the snowpack, and this also increased the dryness of the Colorado climate.
Enter the Passive House, an energy-efficient building standard that has an unintended secondary benefit: fire resistance.
Passive House was originally intended specifically to directly deal with the climate crisis, and buildings are such a significant part of that.
Andrew Michler is a leading Passive House designer. He built the first certified passive house in Colorado. The exteriors of these buildings are made from non-combustible materials. They are also built exceptionally airtight and are equipped with things like triple pane windows that are more resistant to impact, extra thick insulation.
This is about 10 inches of insulation.
Fewer nooks and crannies where smaller fires could start, and a specific ventilation system that even filters out smoke.
There's this old building science adage where we say, build tight, ventilate right. Passive house really embodies these two principles.
Zoe Kaufman is a research engineer at the National Renewable Energy Laboratory with a focus on energy-efficient buildings, including passive house.
I would really focus on airtightness and mechanical ventilation as the core reasons why passive house inherently is great for building around fires.
That's because during a wildfire, wind-blown embers often enter homes through broken windows and attic vents. So sealing off the home and avoiding traditional methods of ventilation makes these homes safer.
And it works just like a regular door, except for when you close it, these clamps come out and grab the frame.
And then you're filtering all of your air and providing balanced ventilation. All of this is going to reduce all of these particles that are not wanted in your home.
So each room is being delivered fresh air 24 hours 7.
Andrew Michler lost his home to a fire in Oakland in 1991. And that connection to the Marshall Fire inspired him to design a more affordable passive house model, specifically for those who lost their homes, like the Sobtis.
You pass me the oil, honey.
After some deliberation, the Sobtis have decided to rebuild their home in their neighborhood.
The whole rebuilding is to show the kids the resiliency. You lose, you build again, and you build again better.
Finding Michler's passive house option cemented their decision.
So the whole idea of passive was already, I was bought into it. I'm like, this is the way to do it. I'm going to do it. And fires are imminent. This is, in my mind, a fire-prone area. Wind has always been very high and felt in the houses.
The hope is that more homes in the neighborhood will sign up for the design, because the more buildings that meet passive house standards in an area, the safer that area may become.
So as each house becomes more resilient to fire, it protects the neighbors, and the neighbors protect the neighborhood, and the neighborhoods protect the community. So there's this kind of cascading effect. Every good decision making the homes better actually improves the entire community as a result.
Great, thank you so much. That's it's in California. I can tell you, $40,000 is much less than 13% of the house cost of a new build. So it's even better news in that sense for the kind of a fully rebuilt house. And I'm Andrew Michler. My experience with fire goes back to 1991 from the Oakland Hills fire, where we lost 38,000 homes, including our own family home. So that's actually where I began my building career. Currently, I live in Masonville, Colorado. And as you can tell, there's a map, and you can see where there's a fire burn scar to the west of me, to the left of me. And that burn scar is the Cameron Peak fire, which was about 225,000 acres, Colorado's largest fire, right in the middle of COVID, spotted onto our mountain. And so this is something near and dear to kind of the world that I'm living in Colorado. I built a passive house on the site starting 10 years ago, so wildfire was definitely on my mind at the very beginning. So I'll go through that process of thinking about passive house specific detailing in fire resilience. And I think there's an incredible synergy between the two that I want to explore with you guys. Kind of the first thing, and just kind of a quick follow-up, is that in building code, there really, for at least on the residential side, for single family, there is basically almost nothing in building code to protect your home from fire outside of perhaps the roofing material. Now, there's lots of local codes that are patchwork, around the country, certain states, limited amount of research as well to inform those codes. So far as we're seeing, it's a kind of a new field in some ways, even though it's been around a long time. There's still a lot for us to learn through these fire events. And kind of one of the first things I started thinking about with the relationship between passive house resilient design and best practices for fire resilient design was, for instance, the idea of form factor, something we're extremely familiar of course, and something that we practice quite deliberately and in quite a detailed way. In the fire sense, though, the form factor plays a significant role. And I've used the analogy of trying to start a log on a campfire compared to a bundle of sticks. The less actual surface area on the building, the less actual capacity it is to start a small fire that leads to a larger fire around the building side. So as Birgitte said before, was that it's not just a large flame front that's necessarily what these buildings start from. They start from small little fires in or around the building and grow from there. And then passive house, of course, you guys all know this, that we can build different form factors. It's just that we take on a penalty of that. So we're not saying that we need to build boxes for passive house, and we don't need to build boxes for fire resilience, but it does have an impact on both terms directly. And just this interesting slide where we look at kind of how eddies that bring in, that usually fire front comes with embers that are driven by significant winds. Most of these large fires are from in wind events. So as we can tell, that the more complexity there is around the three-dimensional shape of the building, the more places there are for those embers to get into, nest, either get inside the building, but in this specific case, start a small little fire around the perimeter of the building, and then build into the fabric itself. And even little things like solar panels. I was looking at these Tesla solar panels, and they have this nifty trim around them, so embers can't really get underneath the solar panels, in between the roof and the solar panel, for instance. So even small details like that really count. And then when we get into the actual fabric of the building, we often see buildings that we like to ventilate. We love ventilating roofs because we don't want rotting roofs. That's great to get rid of moisture, but that's really, really good to introduce embers into the building system. So traditionally, for almost all my houses, passive houses, including the one down in Masonville, is we like to use cathedral ceilings with an unventilated roof system. That seems to have made a significant difference both in the performance of the building as well as the fire resilience. So we don't use ventilated facade systems outside of just between perhaps the exterior and the rain screen. And certainly the roof really don't encourage to ventilate them. And I'll show you a final detail that we are using now for fire rebuilding. The other big thing we're finding, at least in Colorado, I've seen significant window breakage in the mountains. When we have this fuel load that's a forest right next to your house, or perhaps another house that's on fire, often the windows break, and it gives you limited time when that fire radiant front comes. That one pane, two panes break, pretty much, even if you do everything else correctly, you have a completely compromised building. So the idea of using triple pane passive house glass, preferably a little bit smaller than larger, but the triple pane buys you significant more time when that glass pane breaks, just from that first radiant fire front. The other thing that we do in passive house, which I think is really fantastic for fire resilience, is we over-insulate the frames. So the frame itself is protected from embers lodging into it, especially if we use a material that's non-combustible around the frame itself. And then speaking of materials, of course, we know we don't want to just clad the building in tinder, start a little fire. right anywhere around the perimeter of the building onto the building. So, right now, of course, we have stuccos and metals and fiber cement and brick. There's a pretty significant range of great materials to work with. A lot of them are more expensive. I think this is where the cost component comes into, but they're also can be significantly more durable. For instance, the metal roofs are much more durable than the asphalt shingle roofs. So we love to use those on all the projects if we can. Here's a project right next to my house that I built, designed, I think it was completed a year before the fire on our mountain. And thinking about fire resilience, we clad the entire building in metal, the roof and the siding. And in the front, we actually used cork. And cork is a Class A fire resilient material if it has a solid substrate behind it. So that was really interesting to be not necessarily having to use necessarily stuccos or fiber cements or even metals. We can still use organic, softer materials on siding. We just have to be really careful and selective and experimental and really go out there and do research and see what works and what's available. And it feels and smells great, interestingly enough, cork. And then once we get into the bones of the building, as we talked about earlier, is spray foams, are basically gasoline in solid form. They burn extremely efficiently. So avoid them at all costs, no foam construction. But also fiberglass is not really particularly good. Air goes through fiberglass quite easily. So if you do have a fire event within your wall system, flames can get through that fairly efficiently with fiberglass. So almost exclusively, we use on interior walls a rock wool type of material, which has a melting point of like 3,700 degrees. So basically, it does not burn. And then cellulose is low embodied carbon, low cost. Also, it doesn't hold flame at all. It doesn't really melt. It's quite stable in a flame event. But most importantly, because it's dense packed, it doesn't allow air into the wall cavity. So we eliminate air, even if we have fuel, we don't have fire. My own passive house, certified, I think 8 years ago now, it was the first one in Colorado. We did cellulose on the inside, rock wool on the interior wall. Cellulose is the main insulation material, and then rock wool on the outside is a board material. So 2 inches of that material. It's quite rigid, so I found it to be pretty easy to work with. And then use metal for siding and fiber cement over that. So it's a pretty fire resilient wall, especially with the triple pane windows. I used UPVC glass of the frames, so that might be the weak point in this particular building system. And then when we look at kind of lower carbon materials, eco cocoon panels, for instance, are a panel that's a prefabricated panel made of compacted straw. And straw is incredibly fire resilient. In fact, it can give you 190 hour rating if you put a gyp board on the inside of it. So straw just doesn't, because of that lack of oxygen, straw itself, when it's compacted, it does not support flame really at all. And then, of course, the other side we don't talk about. Most people aren't going to be affected directly by fire, but by fire smoke. So we talk about Massachusetts right now, all over the Pacific Northwest, California, Colorado. It's become a regular event. So passive house naturally is airtight with ventilation. We can do quite a bit with that ventilation form in terms of controlling the air coming into the building. And a quick test they did in Australia. This was in Canberra. Sorry, I've done that before. Canberra, Australia, the capital. And there's 2 passive houses built by this architect. Extremely thoughtfully done buildings, the exact same building twice. So in one building, they actually tested the how air tightness during an extreme smoke event affected the building. And on the left-hand side, you can see that the outside air is quite polluted with 600 ppms. Yeah, or I forget exactly what. It's what exactly it's ppms, parts per metric. I'm not a metric guy, so I'm not exactly sure what that size is, but relatively speaking, on the red line is the blue line's the outside. The red line, you can see it, is a typical house, and then the yellow line is a passive house. So the passive house is half of what is outside, in quite significantly better than a typical house in the city. But once we compare that to a passive house with a F17 filter, in our equivalence of MERV 13 filter, that the lower yellow line compared to the standard passive house without really good high quality filtration, it brings the level down to typically what's considered healthy indoor air quality, even in extreme smoke events. So that should be just standard building practices for anybody who has a smoke event, a potential smoke event. For the fire rebuilding, for the Marshall Fire, which destroyed about 1,000 homes, coming out on 2 years ago in December in Boulder County of 2021, we lost a lot of houses. So we're rebuilding back this number of fire houses called the Restore House. And we've been going back and forth quite a bit on the detailing, especially with the roof system. And in this case, we decided that we can ventilate the roof. According to code, we need to ventilate the roof systems, which is exactly what we don't want for a fire condition. So what we're doing is we're actually doing a perimeter vent around the entire perimeter of the roof system, bringing about a 3/4 inch gap between that insulation system and the roof decking, putting a membrane that's fireproof, and then a metal roof on top of that. So that's one of the many details we're doing that. We're also wrapping in the 2-inch rock wool board. And we feel that this will be a pretty fire resilient building, even as these neighborhoods go up, if the neighborhood house next to it goes. We hope and feel somewhat confident that this house is survivable in that condition. And even with the extreme fire event, just the ventilation system, we're putting these ember blocking vents into the HRV intake. So if there's a fire event coming, basically the vent will swell shut and close off the house to active embers coming into the building. So it's those little details we're constantly looking at, trying to think of. There's more to learn to come, but this is kind of a good start. And the synergies between what we're learning with typical classic passive house detailing and then adding the fire resilience is a very, very small lift. And it's just a matter of adding a couple of extra details and material selections that make these buildings work quite well, I think. So that's the end of my presentation.
Hi, everybody. I'm Rob Nicely. I'm a general contractor in California. I own a company called Carmel Building and Design. We work on the Central Coast area, and my part to add is to take a look at a house that we built that survived a fire during the late in construction. And something that was noteworthy about this project for me was that this was the first client I ever had who actually came to me wanting a passive house. And because they lived in an area where the exposure to fire was high, or the risk was high, they also explicitly said that they wanted the house to be very resistant to fire. So an ideal client in that way. This house is far out Carmel Valley, past the point where there's a lot of people. And again, this house was under construction when the Carmel fire happened in the summer of 2020. And most of the houses, this was really the center of where that fire was, and it's on a ridge, very steep incline, and so the fire just rushed up to the top of the hill. And as a consequence, most of the houses on that street burned, were completely destroyed during the course of the fire. So this is a picture of one of the houses on the street, the remains of one of the houses on the street. it was a small fire, and this isn't a very heavily populated area, but again, we were right sort of in the worst place. This is looking off the back deck down towards the neighbor's house, which was destroyed. So we were far enough along that our framing was covered up. And so what I just want to kind of run through the materials we used and strategies we used. Andrew talked about a simple building form. And again, because this was a passive house, the clients explicitly wanted that. We had a simple form, and the long axis was oriented so that we had a really good southern exposure, which also coincidentally and happily faced them to the Los Padres National Forest and this beautiful view. In this case, we wrapped the house with exterior insulation, and we used Gutex in this case, 2¼ inch Gutex, which is a wood fiber product, but very, very slow to catch fire. In fact, on the Gutex website, they show the test where they hold a blowtorch on it for 20 minutes and then look at how much charring you get. So very difficult to ignite. So I just love exterior insulation for all kinds of reasons. It makes it very easy from the point of view of a contractor trying to execute a very high performing home. If you have exterior insulation, right away you have a layer without thermal bridges. Also, it gets the dew point out of the framed assembly, so that the longevity or the durability of the framing is higher. So I love that too. But yes, in this case, there was enough. The climatic conditions were high enough that we needed exterior insulation. This is the only time I've used this product. Normally we use rock wool. I'm doing another certified passive house right now when we're using rock wool, which can be the exterior board insulation, and also it comes in bats or blown in material that you can put in the framed cavities as well. The exterior finishes were stucco and hardy board, cement board, horizontal siding. The roofing material was steel standing seam roof. We had triple pane windows. And the only area that we had that was, you can see that the whole house doesn't have any vents, or excuse me, any eaves. So there was no condition where we needed to deal with the eaves. The area picture here, the entry, was the only place where we had a small area that was outside of the conditioned space. And so this was the only place where we needed vents. And we put in a couple of Vulcan vents, which are of the type that Andrew mentioned, that when they heat up, they swell shut. So you weren't going to get air infiltration or embers going into the building through that. So again, simple form, fireproof materials, and this is just how you execute a building that performs at a really high level in terms of its energy load and also resistive to fire. That's it.
Thank you to our great speakers for those presentations, to Birgitte for setting the stage so clearly as to why fire resilience is such a big concern over a much larger area than might have been expected. And thank you, Andrew, for the overview of design considerations, and Rob for your look at implementing fire resiliency strategies. And I see some questions in the chat, but before we get to those, Rob, I'd love to hear some more about what happened during the fire event in Carmel.
Okay, so luckily, like I mentioned, this house was far enough along that the finishes were on. I also think I said that it wasn't a particularly large fire relative to the scale of some of these fires we're discussing, but Birgitte had a picture of the Paradise Fire, which I also heard a lot about. And the houses on this street looked exactly like the picture she showed. They were just melted down to the ground. and with the fireplaces, if they were a masonry fireplace showing maybe. So this fire started a few miles away from where this house is located. It's out in Carmel Valley, which, if any of you are familiar with Carmel, we're a coastal town, but Carmel Valley has a way different climatic conditions. When you go away from the coast here, it just changes very quickly. So it's an area where it's much hotter in the summer, much colder in the winter, and the fuel gets a lot drier. So this fire started pretty close to Carmel Valley Road. It was up into the area where this house was, which is maybe 5 miles away within a few hours. And this house and this neighborhood is on a ridge, and it's very, very steep. So the fire just came roaring up the slope, and all the houses were, engulfed quickly. I didn't actually get back up there nobody got back up there for about a week after that, but you can see from the pictures that the fire burned right up to the house. It's a sort of an oak savanna is the kind of area it is. So there's a lot of oak trees, and also a lot of grassland. So we have a combination of grass, and then when the fire gets hot enough to catch the oaks, that's when it really gets ripping. So if any of you know about grass fires, they go very quickly. The fire isn't in any one place for very long. So we had a combination of that at our site. We had the grass fire that burned very quickly, and then we had oaks get engaged, and so we had longer, hotter fire there too. And again, because we had the exterior finishes up, the house, for all intents and purposes, was in its finished form when the fire came, and that probably saved us. Although I can't say for sure, what exactly all the different phenomena that kept it from burning. All I know is that it didn't burn, and that the fire did come right up within, the grass was within a couple feet. There were oak trees that engaged that were, 10, 20 feet away, that kind of thing. So we didn't know for several days whether or not the house had burned. We were just looking at the same, the CAL FIRE videos and those kinds of things to find out, but we didn't know and we didn't get back up there on site for about a week. And so that's what happened. We lucked out, or we did well because of the way the house was constructed. I ran through all the methodology, but there was a couple other houses on the street that had stucco and tile roofs that didn't burn. The houses that did burn were the kind of houses you would expect to burn. The other thing is that is important to notice, this is an all-electric house, and I know that the fire department in our area keeps track of where the propane tanks are, and the propane tanks, of course, were exploding during the course of the fire. So not having a propane tank near the house may or may not have been an important thing too.
Great, thanks for that. And I'm going to skip to a very practical question. How do the ember blocking events work? Birgitte, do you want to take this one?
Happy to, yes. So the way ember blocking works is they're very, very fine mesh. So they simply prevent the embers from entering into the house. There's several tests for these. I believe ASTM has a test to make sure that they are functioning the way they're supposed to. But the idea is simply to prevent those embers from being able to enter into the house by having a very, very fine metal mesh there. So that's as simple as it is.
And I understand there's also a different kind of vent with a type of paint that melts during heat events so that it then blocks embers. Has anybody installed any of those?
Yeah, I believe that's the ones we're using, something called the Vulcan vents that we're using for the ERV intake. And the thinking is that we're pretty compromised at that point if we do have a lot of embers coming in, especially near ground level where the intakes are, that we have some level of protection right at the kind of front, so it blocks itself off. I assume that you have to replace them after a fire event, but that for us, it's kind of that's the nightmare of doing all this work, and then your ventilation system is kind of a support system for the fire getting into the ductwork of the housing. So we'll have to do flow. We're doing flow ratings and seeing how that's used. I haven't seen that detail before in other projects, but that'll be standard for all our wildland interface projects going forward.
How about you,
Andrew,
Rob?
what kind of yeah, we've used Vulcan vents, and the vents we use, which I can't remember the name of them right now, they do have a material that expands when they get hot, and that's so it's the fine mesh, like Birgitte was saying, plus the material that expands and shuts off the vent once it reaches a certain temperature.
Hey, Rob, do you have to? Is it a one-time thing? Do you have to
Yes,
replace it?
absolutely. Once they do it, they're done. I was going to ask you, Andrew, too. Just, I mean, what kind of a fuel load did you have on your in your area? Like I said, I have oak savanna. I would imagine you guys have more trees than we do.
Yeah, it's ponderosa pine and extremely dense. I don't think we've had a fire for 100 years. So that fire was burning for probably 30 days or so as we're seeing the smoke, and then it made a run in about 14 miles in one day. And then when it spotted our mountain, it's extremely dense ponderosa pine with that needles on the ground. So once it gets going, there's nothing that'll stop it, even fire breaks, stuff like that. So you could spend your whole life just doing fuel load, cutting trees down, but it's not going to really be sufficient to stop a fire. You're just trying to cool the fire down.
Right,
It does.
and that was a really big fire, so it's yeah, moving through much larger areas.
Yeah, and the other thing is a lot of people think that these fire departments are there. You know, they have the equipment. They'll say to you, when you have 10,000 acres on fire, the fire department may or may not find your particular house amongst hundreds that are. And then Boulder that day, when it spotted on our mountain, Boulder County had a fire, and all the air resources were diverted to that fire rather than our mountain. So, you know, it's really a design problem, in my sense, first and foremost, that the fires will probably come, and what's your survivability of that?
I think you're touching upon such an important thing there, Andrew, that a lot of people think, well, the fire department will come and save me. They'll save my house. That's our traditional thinking from structure fires. But in these situations, there's not just one house on fire. There can be many houses on fire, and they might not be able to get to your house. So you're absolutely right. This is a design issue. We need to design these communities to be resilient in case of fire, because we cannot ask our poor fire departments to be able to fight all these fires. It is simply impossible for them.
And speaking of design issues, there's a question here about the cathedral ceilings and the details there of that, and what kind of insulation you recommend. And Andrew, do you want to take that one?
Yeah, so yeah, it's just kind of the bread and butter is definitely mineral wool board and bat and the cellulose insulation. And it's kind of a costing as well as the carbon question. But in this case, for our restore houses, we were in very small lots, so we needed relatively thinner wall systems. So that's where the mineral board helped with the exterior insulation. And then we actually our mechanical chase is also the structural wall that's cellulose. So it's like so the first defense is that kind of the entire assembly of the mineral wool board plus the fiber cement, and then snuffing out any potential fires within smaller events. They'll be within the structure system itself, hopefully. And then the roof is we're really dependent on that ember blocking material, because we just can't have the underdecking unventilated with codes, local codes. Yeah, that's been quite the battle here, with various degrees of building science to back up the code. So that's been a long time conversation, maybe that will come when we talk about the resilience side. But what we did come up with was finding that if we can get the roof and the peel and stick as fireproof as possible, then if we can get some ventilation underneath of that, just a little bit, they'll pass code, and of course, hopefully get all that moisture build up that does or does not happen underneath of that, but still in a huge extreme ember event that we're going to be really reliant on that fire ember blocking material to do the trick for us. So it's about 6 inches long and 3/4 inches wide. So it's a pretty significant amount of material that embers have to get through.
Could I jump in on this one a little bit? One of the important things so we're talking about whether or not you have to vent that framed space. And as Andrew points out, a lot of times this, rather than being sort of a scholarly discussion about building science, is what your building inspector is going to make you do, and they may or may not understand what you're trying to do when you're building a non-standard building. The important thing is that you make that space, the framed space there, needs to be a part of the inside space. So it needs to have the reason that you can avoid venting that space is because it's not outside of the conditioned space. It's part of so it should have the same. You're not subject then to the fluctuation in temperature and the possibility of reaching dew point. And I mentioned before that the way I think about this is where a dew point is going to happen, and that's different depending on where you're building something. It's dependent on the climate you're building in. But if you totally seal that space, then it's part of the inside space, and then you're not subject to the dew point problem, and then you should be able to just you shouldn't have to vent. One of the ways you achieve that is by completely filling that cavity so that there's no air in there, because if there's no air in there, then there's nothing to get condensation out of. So sort of the way we think about it is that if our pressure boundary is on the outside of that cathedral ceiling space, and you could say the same thing about a conventionally framed building too. It's if you had a flat ceiling, if you make the pressure boundary again at the outside, and then the attic space is for all intents and purposes inside the conditioned space, then you don't have the problems that you would have if you built conventionally, where you put the insulation in the ceiling and the attic is outside space and then needs to be ventilated. Yeah. So the pressure boundary is part of the thing.
And I think, we probably spent $10,000 at least on these projects just to provide that code compliance issue. So it made the assembly more expensive than it needed to be, and not necessarily safer. So it's a work in progress. Absolutely.
So part of it is definitely having a conversation with your building official and making sure that everybody's on the same page about what you're doing and why.
And part of that was we had 1,000, this little teeny town, Superior, Colorado, most of the city was burned away. So they were completely overwhelmed with rebuilds. So we're not going to, in that state, we're not going to have those nuanced conversations. But we were very fortunate to have Passive House really championed in the area with Boulder County, another city. So that really helped us for a certification process as well. So I was grateful for that side of it. These people need to get back in their homes pretty soon. They're running out of insurance money. So that puts a lot of pressure on that side of it.
And there's another topic that nobody has touched on yet, which is retrofitting. I mean, in addition to the homes that burned down during the Marshall Fire, I'm sure there are homes that didn't burn down, but that those people have got to be looking at their neighbors and thinking, how can I fix my house to lessen the chance of me burning in the next fire? And I know, Birgitte, you spoke of the additional costs or for making a new home fire resistant, but have you looked at all at retrofit costs, and have any of the other panelists been approached to do fire resistance retrofits?
So unfortunately, I do not have the cost of retrofit, but you're absolutely right that it is a big issue. It's what we call the 98% problem, because 98% of our buildings are already built. We have a new build rate of about 2%. So we have a lot of existing homes that are sitting there and potentially can be exposed to wildfire. And there are some simple things you can do. If a homeowner is interested in retrofitting, again, I will point to that very, very great resource by IBHS, their wildfireprepared.org website. It will help you through this. It's not just about a new build. It's also about retrofitting existing homes. And I would say for everyone in those situations, start with your landscaping. That is not expensive. That just takes some work to do. And then start looking at the more expensive as you can work your way through that. And this is where we have seen in many states that they have given potentially, cheaper loans and so on for energy retrofits. To me, those should also be connected then to do a wildfire resilience retrofit at the same time. It would be such a great way to combine both energy efficiency and wildfire resilience in these type of programs. So that is what I wish we would see out there. And that is a way we could help homeowners make their homes wildfire resilient going forward.
Have Andrew or Rob, have either of you done any retrofitting for fire resilience?
So, like I had mentioned, this client came to me specifically, and this was a new build. But the short answer is no. But the longer answer is that in the area I work in, there's in California they call it the Wildland-Urban interface zone. And that's, if you're in the wildland-urban interface, then there's all these additional measures that you have to comply with if you're doing a construction. And in my world, that's either a new home or a major remodel. I'm primarily a remodeling contractor. And so you're obliged, if you fall into that area, if your project is big enough, that the fact that you're in the wildland-urban interface is going to be invoked, and you're going to have to do the retrograde work. But the other thing is in Carmel, over the last year or so, lots of people have come to me and said that my insurance agent won't insure my home anymore because I'm in a fire zone and I need to make these upgrades so that I can just get insurance. And so that's kind of where the tension is, or where this is actually playing out, is people can't get insurance, or their insurance is going up really, really a lot unless they comply with the wildland-urban interface. So with regard, I can't answer a lot of questions about cost because I work in a luxury environment, and that's not them, I don't build the same house over and over again, and the choices that people make far outweigh any implication of the cost of doing these kinds of things.
Yeah, come to think of it, we did, right when I finished my place, my neighbor, in my neighborhood, I've been harping for years about just, good forestry management, and started getting groups together and doing thinning along the road systems around houses. And then I did have one neighbor who got really proactive with her house. Wooden siding, she was at the top of the mountain. Wood siding was probably, 20 years old. So we came in, we actually used polyiso, which is not fire, it's fire resilient. It won't carry fire, but it's not fireproof in any means. But then we put a hardy board over that. And then we just did a window retrofit with some white windows with the triple panes, and then overframed those. So she may have spent probably close to $80,000 total, but the house was really in the need for a major upgrade besides, and had comfort issues and all the other stuff. So given the values of the properties nowadays up there, where these houses are much more expensive than when we originally bought them, it's a much smaller percentage as it was before. And honestly, the emotional impact of her having a fire resilient house, especially when we've lost, I think, 12 houses in the last fire event, and there's no reason why we're not going to have another and another. I think just like the emotional impact of feeling more secure, either if they're stuck at home or that they have to leave the house, as we've done several times for weeks on end, that knowing that the potential of the house still being there when they come back is pretty significant. So that's a big part of that outside of just the costing part. So if you do have a house that needs to be retrofitted, it's not much of a cost upgrade to put in the right materials, more of a design issue. If you have a new house and it's not well detailed, it's the hardest thing is to ask people in the mountains, tear down your wooden deck with that beautiful view. That's a pretty tough ask for people. So it's a one by one, often an emotional basis rather than a financial basis for people. And in fact, yes.
Oh, you just bring up so many great points about the overlap between passive house retrofits and fire resilient retrofits. And in general, I mean, of course, that's also true for new construction, the overlap. But, over insulating, airtight structure, high performance windows and doors, all of those, and mechanical ventilation with heat recovery, all those help with fire resiliency as well.
Now you have a 21st century house where you had a 19th century house, and all of a sudden, boom, it's a completely different living space, feels different. And Rob, you brought up the issue of insurance, which is huge where I live also. And, California as a state is having to insure these homes that no insurance companies will take on anymore, which, we can easily imagine is going to have huge financial impacts for the state. And I just wondered if, for myself, I have been doing some fire resilience retrofitting, including boxing in my eaves. But when I approached my insurance company to see how they would that help me with my premiums at all, they said no, but we might not drop you. So it's another important factor. And I don't know, Birgitte, if you have anything else to add about insurance, what you've seen.
So what we are putting out there from NFPA, our Firewise program, where communities work together to make sure that their landscaping and everything around the buildings are more prepared for wildfire and wildfire resilient. We have worked with insurance companies to see have them say, well, if a community is a Firewise community, to then have that show in the premiums. I don't know all the details of this. It's not my area, but I know that it's discussions that are ongoing. But when it comes to individual homeowners making their changes on their own to the buildings and how that's going to affect their premium, it's a much more complicated issue, because as we've talked about, all of us, and it comes down to the whole community. If you are surrounded by buildings that are burning right next to you, it becomes really difficult to survive unless you really have made every single detail absolutely perfect in your wildfire resilient home. But if the entire community has worked together, so we don't have all of these buildings burning at the same time, then suddenly we are in a situation where it's a lot easier to ensure that buildings survive, and that can have an impact. So there's no solution to it yet. I'm sorry, I can't give you a good answer saying this is going to help your insurance premium because we're not there yet.
And Andrew, I believe it was you who brought up another important point, which is decks, how people don't want to give up their decks. And most people's decks are wood-based decks. And which brings me to the thought of, as in the early days of Passive House, it was more expensive to try and build a passive house because there weren't the availability of the products you needed. And decking, I've looked a little into fire-resistant decking, but it's a tough topic to, it's a product that from a cost perspective is very expensive if you're looking for fire-resistant decking. But
there's some tricks, like you could put down, this may not be everybody's favorite look, but you can put down concrete tile on top of your existing structure. Of course, have it structurally reviewed to hold up to that. You can pull out the decking and put pavers there instead. That's kind of the poor man's version of it. And we did a fire in Colorado Springs, and Colorado Springs code, because they did lose some neighborhoods, they said nothing that can burn can be on the outside of your house, no matter what. So, that actually really got people creative, and there's a lot more products available, at least in Colorado, in the region for decking kind of conditions. But on the retrofit side, just like a quick, easy way is just take down that deck board on top and put down like a paver type of material instead. So there's definitely solutions out there that are either high or low, but piece by piece, and have a general plan. Definitely don't worry about your deck if you have a bunch of like shrubs around the house that will instantly turn into candles. So pick your battles.
Rob, is this a top question that your clients are coming to you with, decking questions?
Not specifically, but I do want to, this is like when somebody wants you to do an energy upgrade retrofit, and what you start with is where the most highest utility, lowest cost things, and you go from there and you go up the ladder, right? So Birgitte and Andrew have both said, what's the fuel load look like outside your house? So, there's the things that are easy and obvious, and that you need to do first before you move on to the more difficult, either emotionally or financially or whatever way. There's an operating order that is correct. Another thing, just to pop it in there, is that somebody asked a question in the chat about whether or not there are maps being developed for threat of fire in different neighborhoods. And I know at least the insurance companies have them. So those maps exist. The insurance companies are using them in Carmel to say this neighborhood is, even though they're all in the blue zone that I mentioned, that this neighborhood is a higher threat level than this neighborhood. And so we're, so those kinds of distinctions are being made, just to answer that question.
And there was also a question in the chat about fences, rebuilding with wooden fences, or, what would be a preferable option? Are people addressing that? Is that a question that's coming up for you guys?
For the fire rebuild, yeah, absolutely. I think wooden fences were required, and now they're being just the opposite, where you can't put a wooden fence in. For a lot of it's not really code at all. It's really just subdivisions and basically, building standards for different building or housing organizations there. But the weird thing, and one of our clients is really irritated at the neighbor who said they can't wait to build their house back and get that big wooden deck back so they can see the view. And I think the Paradise Fire, was a huge struggle to get any momentum on building back to fire resilience. So this is an ongoing cultural conversation. the aesthetics of a wooden fence. I don't know.
And on that note, I think we have to wrap up, but it's been a great discussion, and it's definitely a topic that's ongoing, and we're going to be hearing a lot more about in the months and years to come. And thank you, all of you, for your expertise and your time.